All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on how to use ESG to create value in private equity. My name is Jim Beecher. I'm the publisher of Mergers and Acquisitions, the host of today's session. We have a great turnout today, no doubt, due to the very important topic that our moderator and panelists will begin discussing in a minute. I'd like to thank our sponsor, Gobi, for their contribution to today's program. You can learn more about Gobi's platform for ESG management at gobiinc.com. I also want to make you aware of our upcoming virtual conference schedule. In July, we'll be hosting our 4th annual Rising Stars in Private Equity. In September, we'll launch our inaugural Leaders in DEI. And on December 1st, we're going to host our Top Innovators in M&A conference with a focus on firms leading the way in impact investing and ESG strategies. And you can get more information on these by visiting the events tab at our website, themiddlemarket.com. Okay, we've got a lot to discuss here and not that much time left, I guess, only 58 minutes. So let's get the program started. It's my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Healy Lev, who is Chief Revenue Officer and a board member at Gobi. Healy has more than 15 years experience in investment management and ESG and joined Gobi in 2012. Healy, why don't you?
Yes, sir. Thank you so much for the introduction and super excited to be here with these esteemed panelists who have a lot of pearls of wisdom to share. So we will get right into it. Why don't we go around and just do quick introductions of yourselves, your positions, and your firms. And then I have a little bit of a just rapid fire get to know you to maybe add some personality to these small squares that are otherwise repetitive and maybe a bit exhausting at this point. So Bethany, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and your firm first?
Sure, thanks, Healy. So my name is Bethany Gorham, that is my cell phone, sorry about that. I'm a Senior Vice President at Orion Energy Partners, and I head the firm's IDEA Group, which stands for Investor Development, Engagement, and Accountability, in addition to sitting on our ESG committee. So Orion is a private capital solutions firm. We invest across credit, equity, and growth segments, mostly focused on lower to middle market companies and invest anywhere between 20 and 200 million per transaction. We have about 2.5 billion in AUM with a team of 30 people across New York and Houston. And our investment thesis really centers on environmentally innovative infrastructure solutions. So think the new frontier of energy, waste, water, really anything that is kind of driving the energy transition forward. So we've made 18 investments since we launched across subsectors that include renewable fuels, digital infrastructure, waste to energy. So it's a fairly broad mandate.
I love that accountability is in the title of your group because that's going to be a large theme of what we discussed. Definitely something that echoes through and through with regards to ESG. So we will come back to that. Justin, do you want to go ahead and do the same, introduce yourself and your firm?
Sure. My name is Justin Koa. I'm a partner at TZP Group. We are a lower mid-market private equity fund that manages a little over $2 billion of capital through 5 funding strategies. We have 2 buyout funds, mid-market and a small cap. We have a growth equity fund and a SPAC. And I joined to launch our impact fund, investing across all 4 of those verticals. I also lead ESG across our firm-wide portfolio of 27 companies and chair our ESG committee.
Excellent. Thank you and welcome. Happy to have you. And last but certainly not least, Faraz, would you like to introduce yourself and your firm, please?
Yes, yeah, sure, Haley. So thanks for having me. So Faraz from Centerfield Capital. We're a mezzanine slash private equity firm in Indianapolis, based in Indianapolis. Manage just about 600 million under management, currently deploying Fund 4, which is a $335 million fund. And from the ESG perspective, by default, we've gone towards those kinds of investments, just the way we look at investments and how the construct of the portfolio is, but we don't have a strategy as such from the ESG perspective. So interested in sharing my thoughts on how the industry is evolving and how we could be helpful there.
Yeah, and we'll definitely get into that. Okay, so just a bit more get to know you. This super rapid fire. Just gonna ask you guys a couple questions. Talking or texting?
Talking.
Talking.
Okay. Texting. Favorite day of the week?
Do you want to go one way? or I can start. We can go in the same format. So
Doesn't matter. Rapid
Yeah,
fire. It should be wild and random.
For me, any day of the week where I have more wins than losses.
Yeah, I'm gonna go with Thursday. It's that last hump before the weekend. So yeah.
I'm going to go for Saturday because you're just starting the weekend. So.
Excellent. Okay, if you could speak all languages in the world or talk to animals, which would you choose?
All languages.
Definitely, I do not want to hear what dogs have to say about me and how you act.
Yeah, I'd agree.
Okay, and last one, favorite city you have visited other than the one you live in, and then also say that one. So in an example, my example would be Paris and Chicago.
Positano, Italy.
And where are you now? Indianapolis, you said, right?
I live in Indianapolis, yes. The favorite city would be, outside of Indianapolis would be, or even including Indianapolis, would be Positano, Italy.
Excellent.
Probably have to go with Torres del Paine, which is in Patagonia, so southern Chile. It's my favorite city I've ever been to. And I am based in New York.
Cool.
I would say Venice, which has very environmentally friendly transportation. And I live in Palo Alto.
Cool. All right, so we have all the geographies covered. All right, and thank you for letting us get to know you guys a bit. We'd also like to do the same with the audience so that we can cater the conversation to your interests. So just really quickly, on a scale of 1 to 5, with regards to your ESG knowledge, 1 being what does the E stand for in ESG again, and 5 being we are a poster child of ESG and we struggle to figure out how to continue to raise the bar and take things to the next level. Where do you feel that your firm stands on the adoption curve? So if you just want to blast everyone a number 1 through 5 on your expertise, where your firm is at. And this is for the audience. All right, we got a 2. All right, we'll keep them coming in if you're able to enable the chat. Good to know where everyone stands. And of course, if there's any 5s out there, would love to hear your ideas as well. All right, so let's get into it. So a couple things. Why don't you guys tell us how long your firm has been engaged in ESG and where you've specifically found success with regards to ESG and you consider the wins that you're most proud of that you want to share with this group today. And maybe we'll go backwards. So for us, knowing that maybe you're a bit further ahead on the adoption curve, or behind, excuse me, on the adoption curve than the other 2. What have you guys done to date? What are you proud of, and what are your wins thus far?
Sure. Yeah, we have. So as we fundraise every fund, ESG is becoming a bigger topic of conversation than it has been, and boy, it's the frequency is once a week now. In terms of our involvement in ESG, so we've hit a lot of the check marks if it comes to that. So one is, over 65% of our 75 platform investments we've made are in impact, and our partnership, the way we are built is also a pretty diverse group. So we have almost 50%, 40% women and minority managers, and then 60% is not, as well as from companies we've invested in. We like the recycling aspect of the businesses. That's one of the industry verticals we've gained institutional knowledge in over the years. We started with a company in 2006 in the environmental services arena, and since then we've made multiple platforms in that particular sector, which have done thankfully have done quite well for us.
It's good stuff. Just about you mentioned that you were brought into your firm specifically to run Impact Fund and in ESG across the board. What are you most proud of, or what do you consider to be your wins to date?
Yeah, we've been investing significantly in both areas. For us, ESG and impact are different. Not everybody in the industry, but for us, it's an important. So ESG for our firm means a toolkit that any business can utilize, really as a way to de-risk a business and sometimes to unlock value, taking into account the full range of stakeholders that affect the business, investors, management, employees, customers, suppliers, partners, the community, and the environment. And impact, where the world positive value is delivered to a customer aligned to a UN SDG standard and with measurable outcomes attached. And so we've been investing in both practices. ESG touches the entire firm and portfolio. Before I joined, we spent a great deal of effort investing in ESG habits for our nuclear investment firm. And in the past year, we've been investing in a really structured approach for applying ESG across our firm-wide portfolio. And as Bethany will know and appreciate deeply, it takes a long time and it's a great deal of effort to really apply to portfolio companies. It certainly is a long arc activity, but we've made a lot of progress, to date. I would say that about a third of our portfolio is hyper committed to this. They feel the demands of ESG from their customers, and frankly are not leading us, but certainly asking for support so that they can be best in class. About a third are into it and will take our lead, and about a third are wondering how this is material for their business, because frankly, some of our portfolio companies just don't have a lot of ESG exposure, especially from a risk perspective. And we've been helping to usher those conversations over the past year. We've also been investing in our core platform, and so we've established an steering committee in addition to our dedicated core ESG team. The steering committee really is intended to advise and consent, and to be the conduit to our various funds and our various business units. We've also developed a proprietary methodology for applying ESG, not because we actually wanted to, but because the industry hasn't done a very good job at figuring out how to combine various frameworks on the risk side and then providing toolkits for practitioners on the other side. And so we've been spending time building both. So I think that's been a lot of work. It's very proud of our team and what we've accomplished, and frankly, it's a pretty heavy lift for a lower mid-market firm to do it. We're doing it because we think it's in our economic interest to do it. We can talk about how we make that that pitch and appeal to our portfolio companies, but it has been a lot of work over the past year.
Seems like you folks have been busy and made some good progress to date. Bethany, what about you guys? Where has Orion found success with regards to ESG, and what are your wins that you're proud of that you want to share thus far?
Yeah, sure. No, I think to echo Justin's comment, I think one of the most important things to realize about the feat of building out a best-in-class ESG program is that it doesn't happen overnight, and it requires firm-wide buy-in, a pretty sizable budget. And so I think, at least from Orion's standpoint, ESG informally has been a key tenet of our investment philosophy from the beginning. But from a formal standpoint, we really built out a robust ESG practice, probably starting that engagement around 2018. I think the biggest wins for us have been, first, the implementation and enforcement of an actual structured ESG integration framework for conducting pre-investment due diligence. So essentially how we approach ESG specific underwriting, which requires deal team involvement, requires senior leadership oversight. So how we kind of went about that. So it's kind of similar to an ESG steering committee, as Justin had said, but a dedicated ESG investment committee. So that when every deal is brought forward for final approval with the investment committee, it has to go through a separate but parallel process solely dedicated to the evaluation of ESG risks and opportunities. Building out that approach when you don't have a standard framework, like Justin had mentioned, across sectors, industries, supply chain characteristics, whatever it may be. Our approach has been much more individualized based on each company's different materiality characteristics. So we'll look at sector, subsector, geography, supply chain characteristics, technology applications, and with that, then deals can be moved forward. I think one new initiative that is something we're really excited about and proud of is how we have turned that into a contractual agreement with our portfolio companies. So we actually have now started using ESG covenants that are included into our investment term sheets, which is basically ensuring that our portfolio companies can get us the data and information that we need in order to report back to our limited partners who, like Faraz had mentioned, increasingly you are expected to be able to report and engage in kind of a collaborative dialogue around how you're managing ESG risks and opportunities on a much more frequent and much more intensive basis. So we kind of recognized that and then said, well, whatever we're committing to report back to our LPs, we also have to make sure that that kind of trickles down the chain to our portfolio companies. So I think those two areas have been pretty instrumental in getting us to that next step of building out our ESG practice.
And especially the notion of kind of coming at it with a plan. So a friend of mine who works with GRASP, which is a ESG framework for commercial real estate, has said as the industry kind of matured, there were all these random acts of sustainability that were happening. So people doing the right things, or like the heart's in the right place. And I think, Justin, on our prep call, you mentioned as well that your firm had been doing some things that it was all good stuff, but someone had to kind of come in and conduct the orchestra, if you will. And that does start with having kind of a top-down plan or framework. The folks and customers that we talk to, perhaps they've started doing some grassroots things in-house, or perhaps it is part of the DNA of their investment thesis or their strategy, what they're trying to do firm-wide, but they haven't yet formally put that down on paper or had any kind of policy framework roadmap. So one thing that we advise is to start off with a materiality assessment. And that's really going to give you the strategic, you interview the stakeholders, get an idea of what's material to the stakeholders, what's impactful to the business, kind of plot it out, and then come up with a 12-month, 24-month, 36-month plan of how you're going to tactically execute on objectives that tie back to what's materially important to your firm. And that's a good start. So, and one of the objectives that we had promised to cover today is how can PE firms define ESG goals and what's material? So, like I said, my my advice to folks that come to Gobi for help with that is to start off with that materiality assessment and to kind of get the lay of the land and figure out what your unique roadmap is. Do you guys, can you speak to that at all? Is that kind of how you got your start, or was it more efforts were happening and then someone kind of came in and wrangled them all in and made sense of them, or did you get the opportunity to sit down deliberately and make a plan? And we can go maybe backwards this time. So I'll start with Bethany.
Yeah, I mean, for us, I think it was a little different because historically in the evolution of Orion's platform, we started out in energy infrastructure investing, like core energy, traditional energy. And so we had an added responsibility to report on climate risks, given that was the thematic focus of our investing. I think as we've transitioned further away from traditional energy into environmentally innovative solutions, that has expanded how we're thinking about materiality from moving away from just a risk perspective, but also to the opportunity perspective. So where can we find measured sustainability outcomes, whether that be in the form of carbon, water, fuel, or even on the social side, things like climate justice, environmental justice. But I think that where the initial materiality assessment is very much linked to your thesis, defining what's material on an ongoing basis can't be something that is set in stone. As we learned from COVID, as we learned from the rapid developments in the fight against racial injustice this year, how we define materiality, the questions that we're going to be asking portfolio companies, it looks completely different today than it did 18 months ago. So I think that it's defining goals set around your thesis, if you are not a generalist investor, is important. And there's resources, whether that be SASB's materiality map, S&P Global has a bunch of great resources, but SASB aligned reporting, all those sorts of things. But I do think that keeping your program and your approach to the data that you're collecting to assess materiality it should be flexible to change in line with the rapidly evolving landscape of risk and opportunity.
Justin, you're forever in the middle. So whether I go this way or this way, you're always going to be second.
Well, that's the story of my life. So I'd second that. I think, one of the things that is the subtext of ESG, but it's worth saying out loud, because I think there is a misunderstanding of what being a good ESG actor is. A lot of folks say, are you doing ESG well or right? And I don't think that's actually the right way to think about it. It's a sort of continuum. ESG really, to me, those best practices will evolve over time. And so the demands and needs will evolve over time too. And so to Bethany's point, what is important today will be different tomorrow. And what's sort of interesting about ESG, and frankly why you need dedicated resource to focus on it, is because the demands change, and sometimes the dedicated resources are the ones and sometimes you're pulled by some of your stakeholders for that change. And so for some of our portfolio companies, we see that they are getting asked almost on a weekly basis in their RFPs for their sales, how they're responding to different ESG initiatives. And those ESG initiatives that their customers care about or their partners care about are different. Sometimes it's about DEI, sometimes it's about their environmental footprint, sometimes it's about compensation or the values, how they think about sort of cultural appreciation. And so it's pretty interesting. Some of the companies are having so many demands that it's like watching Darwinism happen in real time. And you just really see evolution happen. And the market is changing really right in front of our eyes. And so what is material today for a business is going to change. What's frankly material for us as an investment firm is also changing. We see that piece and the kind of questions that we're getting asked, the kinds of requirements that are on us for reporting. And sometimes we are ahead of it, and frankly need to explain all the work that we're investing in because our LPs aren't asking those questions. And sometimes we're responding to LP demands because everybody cares about DI, or at least lots of our LPs do at the moment, but they care in different ways. And so there aren't standard templates. And so we're responsible for all of us who applied to college 20 some odd years ago. There wasn't the college standard app. And so we have to respond in different ways to different demands. I do think the industry is moving toward a formalization, but I don't think that's happening in the next year or so. And so when we think about materiality, it's a very it's good. It sounds good in general. In practice, it's hard because changes, and for a firm like ours, maybe a little bit different than Bethany's firm, is that we're a generalist investment organization, and so our companies really just have very different exposure, very different demands on their businesses. And so what's material to one is just may not be material to another. And so just maybe to put a fine point on your question, for us, materiality demands sort of a constant revisiting of what's important to the business. And the way that we define materiality is through how I described in the beginning, sort of a risk assessment and an unlocking value. And so are there things that could impair our asset value either as a surprise or a predictable way? And vis-a-vis all the stakeholders I outlined. And then are there unlocking value opportunities for our portfolio companies that can materially change the net asset value of our businesses? And we spend a lot of time thinking about that.
sense. And yeah, you guys both touched on two things that, we're seeing pretty consistently. One is with regards to the emerging frameworks and which one is going to be the prevalent one, of choice. And I think that will kind of present itself as time goes on. We saw the same maturity within commercial real estate. There was a bunch of them. Everyone was trying to figure out which ones to do. And now it's all very civilized. The LPs all ask the same thing. They all report into the same framework. The GPs know where to report. They get categorized. They get ranked amongst their peers. So the drive definitely comes from the LPs as to, which frameworks. And like you said, now it's a bunch of, everyone's asking for the same things, right? It's the same KPIs, it's similar concepts, but they might all be asking for it in a different way. So that's where, the third parties or the outsourced service providers come in, is just to help streamline essentially the same information. And then also get some tentacles down into the portfolio companies. So this era of, we have a firm-wide policy that was maybe enough the last time we went to fundraise, or we have a web page about our ESG efforts, is now not cutting it with the increased pressure that we're seeing from the LPs and the demands. You really do have to go deeper than just the firm-wide policy, and especially if you're an impact fund, of course. But impact and ESG are a bit different, of course, and we'll talk about that a bit later and how they go hand in hand. And then the other thing I'll say too is that it seems to fall on the head of the investor relations person, for all intents and purposes now. But at some point, like you said, Justin, it's going to become a more full-time thing. Some of it is just keeping tabs on the LP demands, keeping things current. But some of it is just, it's not a part-time hat. And that's a similar evolution we saw as real estate kind of did this over the past decade. It was someone within the firm that wore the ESG hat part-time, and now it's matured into a VP plus level type position that's a full-time dedicated resource to ESG or sustainability. So consistent with, what we're seeing. So for us, you did not get a chance to answer the question just yet, but we're asking, how can PE firms or someone especially embarking for the first time define your ESG goals and identify what's material to your business? And do you also echo the sentiments that it's an evolving thing? It's not something you do once and put in a drawer. What have been your experiences?
Yeah, well, all yeses there. In our experiences, Haley, a little bit like yours, what you're suggesting. So for a lower mid-market fund like ours, where we have under $1 billion under management, managing Fund 4 with 335 million, it's super difficult, I think, unless you are dedicated to ESG or impact or some kind of social or environmental kind of investment thesis. It's pretty difficult, right, to hire a full-time associate or individual to manage that sort of it, especially which you said earlier, LPs have different templates and they look at ESG different. European LPs look at ESG totally different than an American LP does. An Asian LP looks at it somewhat different. So for us, for a lower mid-market fund, it's pretty difficult to track it the way they want us to. And our associates, boy, they're spending a lot of time on filling out data at this point. That wasn't even part of the initial investment from the LP, but now it's becoming an investment because they are reporting back to their, for example, the fund of funds is reporting back to their LPs on how impactful a group like Centerfield is. So our challenge is really getting more of a templated version of ESG and what ESG really means to groups. And for example, the SBA, SEC, the government is working on it. I think they're still figuring out what it means to them, whether 50% ownership, women-owned is a socially impactful business, or whatever else it is, what kind of percentages they have there. So it's Justin's group is sophisticated, Bethany's group is sophisticated. They know what they're looking for. For smaller groups like ours, we are still evolving and thinking through what it means. I mean, for what it's worth, we do have a page on ESG now in all our materials, which we present to our LPs, suggesting to them how we are looking at it and why we are different.
Have you found that page, to be sufficient with keeping up with the demands for now, for the time being?
It depends, right? It depends on the LPs. Some LPs are saying, wow, this is great, very helpful. For example, the pension, teachers pension fund, right? I mean, they could be more focused on ESG than a commercial bank LP. Although commercial bank LPs are now moving towards that sector as well. I can tell you it's interesting. The takeaway for me in some conversations is, some LPs also give a little bit of pushback, right? That, why are you focused on these aspects of the business, and why are you doing specifically this type? So anecdotally, I feel that there's a little bit of pushback, but I would say 90 or big percentage is going towards the ESG focus. At least they're tracking it more than they ever used to.
Yeah, I mean, what we're saying or what we're seeing is, if there was a silver lining of the chaos that was the past 12 plus months, it really has shed additional light on the importance of ESG. It doesn't feel like something that can be neglected or pushed off to the side. It really has become mainstream, and things like climate change and diversity are not concepts that can be ignored, whether or not you're an impact fund, whether or not you're small or big. You have to address it in some formal way. And again, that's where, a good service provider can come into play, is to kind of scale with you. So do you need help out of the gate establishing an ESG program, doing that soul searching, doing the materiality, figuring out what to do and how to do it? Or do you just need to augment a current program with some heavy lifting because it's just gotten to be too much or too burdensome for an in-house resource? Or to your point, with you guys, you might not ever have a full-time dedicated ESG person. It's just not in line with the size of your firm and what you're doing. So the flexibility with an outsourced partner is important too. And that's what we're seeing increased demand for, as well as it can't be ignored anymore. And perhaps the homegrown program isn't cutting it. If you don't have the dedicated resources, people are looking for outside help. Now, part of this too, and this gets us to another concept that we had an objective that we had hoped to discuss today. So the impact of greenwashing and how to avoid it. Greenwashing is a real thing, whether it's intentional or unintentional. I tend to, give people the benefit of the doubt. I'm going to say it's unintentional. People put up a page, or maybe there's just a disconnect, or they don't have the wherewithal, tools, capability, capacity to track what's actually going on, effectively communicate the data points. But, in response to this, the SEC has formed an ESG task force and some potential implications to false claims or greenwashing. The task force itself is something like 27 people, and there's a whistleblowing hotline where you can actually report some of these false claims. So again, trying to figure it out and put some teeth into these things. So I might ask you guys, just given where you're at, does that scare you? Do you feel like you're well positioned? What's your kind of take on greenwashing and some of this regulation that's coming down the path? And maybe we'll do middle out this time. So Justin, you go ahead first on that.
I think the industry will benefit from guidance from regulatory bodies. I'm hoping that it allows flexibility based on size of investment firm and company. Obviously, a Coca-Cola sized company is going to have different capabilities, needs, and risk ESG exposure than a middle-sized company or a small company, and we want to make sure that we have the right expectations for the right size companies. But frankly, organizing the industry around terminology, reporting expectations will benefit everyone. The fact that we have to take our view on SASB and our view on TCFD and our view on satisfying B Corp methodology, and if we have a European investor have to consider GRI, and we have to mush it all together, is a lot of work for a firm of our size, and frankly, is a lot of work for a firm that would be even an order of magnitude bigger. And so having some prescription would, I think, benefit the industry and would, anesthetize some of the real concerns about greenwashing. I think in general, LPs will really start to benefit from if they develop a vocabulary for noticing differences in their GP responses. And GPs can notice the difference between their company's responses to really understand the risk exposure that different businesses have, so that you're not just completing a template, but that should lead to a view that your assets are less risky or have more value to unlock. If we had a structured approach to understanding that, I think the industry will start to really gravitate toward reporting in a transparent way, because it'll be in everyone's economic interest to do that. And so the more structure we have, again, appreciating that there really are different capabilities, needs, and exposure for different kinds of companies, will benefit everyone. And at the moment, the industry is left to organize, figure it out itself, and in the context of shifting frameworks. And so different frameworks apply to different companies. There's a reasonable amount of discretion for which framework you want to adhere to. That is just not the case in terms of financial adherence and disclosure. And so we all have to comply with GAAP and internationally with IFRS. That's not subject to discretion, and I think benefits, frankly, all of us as practitioners, because we at least know the rules of engagement.
A fair point, and it's a good segue to a question that was asked. So, Dan Winters of GRESB asks, how do private equity firms measure success with ESG? How do you compare yourselves to competitors to judge if one firm's program is superior to another's? So, to Justin's point, if there isn't a prevalent framework, or there isn't a one size fits all, or there are still kind of just different focuses and different demands from different LPs, I'll ask you, how do you measure success, or how do you kind of peer benchmark against others to judge if your program is good? And then I'll also ask maybe an obvious question, is that important to you at this phase or maybe in the future? So maybe Bethany, why don't you speak to that as someone who has an established program? How are you benchmarking yourself against your peers? Is that important to you? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think the number one way we're benchmarking ourselves is by hearing our LPs' feedback on us relative to other GPs that they have committed capital with. Beyond that, I think that UNPRI, or the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment, they have just put out a brand new reporting template that this year goes into really granular detail, mapping out exactly where you are scored and what weights are applied to different scores associated with your broad kind of ESG and stewardship practice. I think that can be a helpful guidance in benchmarking yourself. But I think ultimately, if this is a bad answer, but it's going to change depending on if you're talking about a specific asset class, if you're talking about public markets versus private markets versus corporates. So I think that there's no like one right answer, but I think that the best way that you can defend the kind of greenwashing piece, to get to the last question, is to have your ESG policy made publicly available, and to read other people's ESG policies and to see what the scope of those policies is and how they approach the full ESG integration process, from pre-investment to post-investment portfolio monitoring and engagement. I would look at their ESG reporting practices, but I also think that being clear and transparent with your limited partners and broader stakeholder groups about what you are currently doing and where the room for improvement is, and always stating in every ESG report or in every letter related to ESG what your goals are for what success looks like 12 months from now. So for us at Orion, that is moving over to a software or platform-based data collection process for portfolio companies, recognizing that we want to get more efficient in those KPIs and applying analytics to them. The next is a more formal process for LP engagement. So does that look like a formal LP advisory committee? Does that look like an annual event? We're kind of still fleshing that out. And then also looking at the impact measurement side of like measuring sustainability outcomes. Even though like we're not an impact firm, we're also wanting to respond to questions around, if we say we're environmentally innovative, how can we back that up beyond qualitative measures and really show some quantitative metrics around it?
It's exactly consistent with what we're seeing. And again, it kind of just depends where on the adoption curve folks are. So someone who's kind of coming in saying this ESG thing matters, I got to do something, I'm getting pressure from my LPs, where do I start? You're not talking to them about quantitative metrics and collecting data from portfolio companies and setting targets and goals, not out of the gate anyways. That's a year, 2 year, 3 thing. First, you want to come out with some qualitative measures. You want to figure out if you're going to subscribe to these other frameworks and what makes sense. So it is definitely a crawl, walk, run. And I think that, you know, those who got the advantage of having a head start have the advantage of having a head start, and they're going to shape what this industry looks like. They're going to shape the relevant rating systems. They're going to get the attention from the LPs. And I think the others, you know, will catch up to an extent that it's relevant, you know, to what they're doing and to who their investors are. And it's not a one size fits all, not at all. All right, so let me ask, we talked a little bit earlier, there's some different notions, and Bethany wrote a nice blog post kind of talking through them, but you hear about impact, you hear about ESG, you hear about philanthropic investing, responsible investing, sustainable investing. Bethany, maybe break that down for us a little bit. What are, you know, do they all intersect? Is one superior to the other? What's your take?
Yeah, I mean, luckily my response to this question 6 months ago was a little bit more frustrating when people were using the terms ESG investing and impact investing interchangeably. But I think, I mean, ultimately some
of them still are, some of them still are.
You know, I think that there was a misconception in the market that, first of all, being an impact investor meant that you had to accept a concessionary return profile in exchange for positive environmental or social outcomes. Today, we're seeing that that is the exception and not the rule, that you can be an impact investor like Justin and have a specific mandate that is a part of your investment thesis, and your impact is an intentional strategy. And you can still target above market returns in addition to those positive social attributes. On the ESG side, ESG is not an intentional strategy. ESG is a responsibility that is shared by all investors, regardless of what sector you're investing in. You know, you could be an HR tech fund or a fund that only invests in HR tech and still be a best-in-class ESG organization or have a best-in-class ESG practice. So I think that as we now kind of understand the difference between impact investing versus responsible investing, and that then somewhere in the middle, probably where Orion sits, you can also still be a sustainable investor and target themes surrounding environmental and social governance, but it doesn't mean that that's written in your fund documentation. I think that distinction is really important when you think about what's happening in Europe right now with SFDR, or the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, where you are having to categorize yourself under a specific, like Article 8, Article 9, or Article 6. And based upon how you're registering yourself, those are different commitments that you're held accountable for from a metrics and reporting perspective on ESG performance versus measured impact outcomes. So, you know, depending on how the kind of SEC public comment period, you know, shapes out around at least the climate disclosure piece, I think that's going to be something important for people to keep in mind.
So I was trying to get off mute. Thank you for breaking that down. I like what you said yesterday on our prep call about, you know, being a responsible investor. That shouldn't even be something that, you know, you're drawing attention to. You should just be a good fiduciary, responsible investor. If you want to tie that into things like ESG and impact and otherwise, but that's almost like bare bones expectations. All right, so Justin, question for you. So you mentioned that, you know, your firm had been intellectually committed to ESG for a long time. It felt a bit unstructured or unsystematic. It was, you know, as I mentioned before, maybe the notion of random acts of sustainability or ESG. And you came in to formalize, launch that, and really kind of take it to the next level. Would you have preferred that? Is it good to come into a firm that's doing some of the right things and try to wrangle that? Or would you have preferred kind of just coming in blank slate, designing the program ground up?
Yeah, I think it definitely helps to join to join a firm that is already bought in. You know, you really need serious commitment to invest in ESG practices. It is a lot of work. It is a lot of time and financial expense. And so starting off, you know, even doing things in an unstructured way is helpful because it shows that there's a commitment. What I'd say is that and impact is the next step. And so a TDP group is one of the first market private equity funds have launched a dedicated impact strategy because it's actually pretty hard to do. And so we have a similar rubric for thinking about that continuum that Bethany touched on, it's not novel to us. I think Tideline authored it, but the ABCs, A meaning avoid, which is a responsible investment screen. B meaning benefit, which is really about ESG best practices, and C being contribute, which is what are you giving to the world, and that's an impact strategy. And so a lot of firms, it's easy to declare things that you don't want to invest in. I would say that it's actually not especially hard to do that from an economically rational perspective, because if you're investing in world negative things, you may well get caught up in regulation and changing consumer habits that make your investments less valuable in the future than they are today. And so, and we see that all the time. In fact, you see that with, as an example, internal combustion engines. General Motors declaring that they're ending, the use of internal combustion engines by 2035. So if you are in that industry, you can start to plan a path where that is a less exciting prospect, and you have to reimagine and reinvent your business model. When we think about impact investing, I think there's a real misunderstanding about what that means, and I agree with Bethany that there had been a mindset that to be a good impact investor meant that you had to concede returns, and I don't think that's true at all. And I think that there's a number of really great examples of firms who have performed extremely well financially. Impact investing is not a comment on your desire or ability to concede returns. Impact investing is really a comment on your ability to serve underserved markets, find and to map supply where there is latent demand that hasn't been addressed. And so when you think about underserved, marginalized, discriminated, disadvantaged populations, and for our group, we've outlined 10 major groups that we'd like to serve from the social perspective, that those groups hadn't been well served by the market. We think that there are innovations, business models, changing consumer habits that will address those. And we're applying private capital to fill gaps where the market was inefficiently working. And you can see that that dynamic at play throughout our economy. You can see that in the environment. You can with environmental technologies. You can see that with changing consumer habits, with the demand for better for you food, better for you materials, and so the being a good impact investor is noticing when there is been a group that has historically not been served well, that there are emerging business models that might serve them well, and deploying private capital and operational capability to help those business models thrive. And that's really what impact investing is. And to do that, you can be a phenomenal investor. In fact, up until very recently, the world's richest person became that way because he was committed to ending fossil fuels, especially in the transportation industry. And so you don't necessarily have to sacrifice returns to be an impact investor. They're not. Those are not common concepts.
That's consistent with what we've heard too. I mean, if you ask any LP or investor, would you sacrifice even fractions of points of returns, to do the right thing or have an ESG policy or have an impact? Like, really say like, no way. It's like all things equal. For the most part, anyways, that's what I've heard in my comings and goings. All right, so we're 10 till the hour. There's some good questions that have come in from the audience, so I'd like to get to a couple of those. So Catherine asks, would love to hear if there's been friction with the sellers in adding those ESG covenants, and what does Orion do in those situations? So sounds like that's a question for you, Bethany.
Yeah, no, I think that there probably would have been friction if we would have just all of a sudden started asking our portfolio companies to agree formally and contractually. However, we'd had a history of 2 years of going through this data collection process and working with them. I think that where we sit and who we target, it's often a very overlooked investment universe The transactions are typically very complex, have a long execution timeline. These companies really see us as more of a private equity partner, even though we're a credit investor. And so therefore it is, we haven't received friction. I think if anything, we've seen enthusiasm and a willingness. We've actually now also started requiring that all of our portfolio companies adopt their own ESG policies, in which will help to craft what is included in them. But it is meant to be more of a collaborative sort of covenant, because we recognize that many of them don't know where to start. That's sort of where we want to come in and want to help shape them, because we do see ESG as a value driver for the portfolio companies, whether that be for M&A purposes, talent acquisition, and yeah, we've seen just overwhelming enthusiasm to engage.
Excellent, thank you. Another question from Gary. How do you attempt to measure the tone at the top? And I don't know, didn't specify tone at the top of like your own firm as the GP or tone at the top as in the LP community, but interpret and feel free to have a stab.
You know, I can just go from, again, from a generalist perspective. You know, it's challenging, right? I mean, the whole, again, from the lower mid-market, the number of deals out there is limited and finite, and then honing on and further on this particular sector, or, I mean, we are all returns focused, right? At the end of the day, that's the goal, objective we've promised our LPs, so it's always difficult. However, the tone at the top is critical. For example, I'll give you two quick examples from our perspective. So we have transformational ideas we bring out every year from our team, and one of the ideas which is not transformational, I think it's pretty relevant, is that having one board member at each portfolio company being a minority or a woman, having a requirement that way. So that's one example. The other example is Impact has, you know, our ESG related companies and environmentally friendly companies have done very well for us over the years. So that's a pretty strong validation that returns are working and also doing the right thing at the same time. So I think it all starts from top and leadership 101, right? I mean, it just flows from there. If we are doing the right thing and investing capital, keeping the fiduciary of returns in mind, I think it works out well.
I would just add that I think in order to measure the tone at the top, it's pretty easy just to look at how engaged senior leadership is and how they're held accountable for ESG performance and practice. You know, at least for us, that means the most senior representative from a co-founder's perspective, from our legal team's perspective, from our investment team's perspective. So all of them, you know, share in the kind of ownership of the broad ESG practice. So I do think that looking at where the ESG function sits within an organization is a really good first indicator. If it's just within the marketing department and there's no direct line up to senior leadership, then you're probably going to be able to, you know, assume that the tone at the top is not quite where it needs to be to lead towards kind of a best-in-class sort of adoption.
I love that. Yeah. That absolutely makes sense.
I'd say it's an interesting question, because what we've seen is we have differentiation at our firm. One of them is our ESG program, and for companies who care, they care a lot, and so we find that it's honestly a reason to win. And so it doesn't resonate with everybody, but we're the people who resonate, it resonates extremely strongly. And so, frankly, we want to partner with groups who care about taking into consideration the stakeholders that affect their business, people who care about their employees, people who care about their customers, people who care about the community and environment. It speaks to how they're going to act as partners with us, and it speaks to how they think about creating long-term value. And so it's frankly been flipping that conversation on its head, not about who leans away, but who leans so far into this that they think that this is the future of their business. They want to do more of this. They are keen to learn it, and we're just seeing that forward posture constantly. And frankly, it's like I said, a reason for us to win and not be the highest dollar in.
Makes sense. All right. get to a couple more of these questions. What changes to the governance piece of ESG have you seen PE firms make with their portfolio companies? So I do hear this question a lot. I think the E is pretty obvious as to what the E addresses, you know, KPIs, energy, water, waste, carbon, the S, you know, some of the social concepts, but people always do want to hear some elaboration with regards to governance and what that means. So what changes have you guys seen to that governance piece with regards to the portfolio companies?
Well, I can go. I think you know, there are actually a number of changes I would say across each. Frankly, even on the E, for many companies, maybe most companies, their environmental exposure is a new concept for them. That figuring out how to measure their environmental exposure is reasonably complicated, and having a real view beyond carbon is entirely immaterial for many businesses. And so I think in each one of these categories, there's a lot of wrestling around. And question about governance, you know, there is a conversation around ESG policies. Cybersecurity has been an increasing focus for all businesses, and I think, you know, cybersecurity is a sort of interesting example that, you know, it's been something that has been asked in diligence. It you know, can be a diligence item, but it's, you know, a small one. It's sort of it can be sort of a footnote in some ways. But what you're seeing is that it's sort of really moving into core diligence work and core operational work, because frankly, we have lots of cybersecurity threats, even at small firms, and that's a real risk. And so when you think about ESG, if you recall my definition, ESG is about de-risking a business and about unlocking value. These kinds of policies are really about de-risking a business. Certainly, you can't protect against all risk, but you can be forward thinking about getting ahead of it. And we don't have to look very far. We had a hack on a national, gasoline pipeline, and so it can affect any company, large or small. And so the kinds of codification of policies are not, just check the box exercises. It's because they actually are material. These are all material to the business. How you treat employees, how you manage cybersecurity, how you are a fiduciary to your investors. And so we see that codification of policies as core and totally material.
Yeah, I think you touched upon it too. I mentioned before the pandemic and the change in landscape really brought forth, some of these concepts. And within the G, things like resiliency, risk management, who's going to survive things like this, the unforeseen, the climate disaster, the pandemic, the cyber attack on the gasoline pipeline. Those are the stronger that are going to survive, right? So it's more than just, a conceptual concept under the G. It's something that really does materially impact, the vitality and success of the business. All right, so 1 minute left. I think we can try to get to this last question. So it's a long one if we can, but we also want to wrap up on time. All right, how do you differentiate policy versus the commitment to make decisions that are pro ESG? At a business roundtable in 2020, CEOs of more than 180 major companies committed to deliver value to all stakeholders. 48 companies that responded to the highest level decision maker was to approve the decision. Only one said the decision was approved by the board. So how do you assess policy versus C-suite and board commitment to ESG? So there's almost no time to answer that. Any last thoughts, closing thoughts before we wrap up on that or otherwise?
A little bit is two parts of the question. I think the first part, differentiating policy versus commitment. The policy document should really be what outlines and guides how decisions are made, so that in that document, it very clearly says what your approach is for, pre-investment, the investment agreement, post-investment, in which there should be some mention of senior leadership and at least some link to senior leadership, like engagement or oversight. But I think that making decisions that are pro ESG, that kind of gets back to the difference between ESG and impact. I think pro ESG just stands for 3 areas of non-financially, but potentially material risk. And so all decisions should be pro ESG. Is it pro environmental or social impact? It could be, but I think, again, that's a really important differentiation to make.
All right, great session today. Thank you guys so much for your time. Obviously, a lot to discuss. If anyone wants to continue the conversation offline, I'm personally happy to do so. Thank you guys for sharing your pearls of wisdom and for being here today. And I hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon. Take care.
Thanks, Justin.